Kristen. Welcome. I haven't seen you in a long time. I want to welcome my friend Tim Johnson, WTSA, to the State House. It's good to have you here.
Thank you for offering to buy lunch.
I not only offered to buy lunch, but I suggested if you try to get into this town again without a visa pre-stamped, we're going to arrest you. Thanks for joining us. We just wanted to answer any questions you might have. I know it's been a busy week in Vermont. Just want to make a couple of quick comments about my concern as we head to Washington for the winter National Governors Association meeting. My concern with the continuing resolution that's being promoted by the Republican Congress. And obviously, if they were to go forward with the continuing resolution, it would have a devastating impacts on Vermont and the other 49 states. I have sent a letter to the leadership in the House expressing my concerns. Just to give you a couple of quick points, as we're working hard to balance our budget here in Vermont and make some very tough choices, which, as I've said before, we must do, this would make our job, should the continuing resolution become law, extraordinarily difficult. If you look at some of the cuts that they're proposing to our 2011 budget, it is so draconian that if you talk to some of the community action agencies, as an example, they would have to send back money that they've already spent in order to survive this year's budget. A couple of quick points. 50% reduction in the LIHEAP program. That, to a cold state like Vermont, where we have 25,000 Vermonters relying on federal assistance to ensure that they don't freeze in the wintertime, that would be devastating to our state. Head Start program, they're talking about $1 billion reduction to the Head Start program that helps low-income children get a Head Start to ensure that we try to do prevention, have them ready to learn when they get to school. We're talking about nearly 25% of Vermont's children in the Head Start program under the continuing resolution losing their funding. 25% arbitrarily thrown off of the program. Community service block grants, it's a 50% reduction proposed there. That's a 50% reduction, or $3.7 million this year alone, to our community action agencies that are insulating people's homes, feeding hungry people, putting folks back to work. Devastating impact on terms of family services and Planned Parenthood and family planning. As you know, the reductions there, we have almost 20,000 women who received their health care through Planned Parenthood. The reductions would mean the elimination of some of Vermont's 10 Planned Parenthood clinics in this state. It means that women who are getting preventative health care, the ensuring that we're checking for cervical cancer, breast cancer, and other debilitating diseases, they would lose those services. So we can go on and on. Huge cuts, 10% cuts to the WIC program. As you know, the WIC program gives pregnant women who do not have adequate incomes food to ensure that we have healthy babies. It affects rail. As you know, I'm committed to rebuilding the Western Rail from Bennington to Burlington through Rutland. The dollars that were allocated to improve Western Rail, many of them would have to be returned. So, devastating impact. We go to Washington this week for an extraordinarily important NGA meeting, and my message is going to be, we have a tough enough job as 50 governors trying to balance tough budgets and tough times. We're going to do our job, but we must find the balance between the hundreds of millions of dollars that Congress made the judgment to send to states like Vermont to help us survive the worst recession in American history, and balancing the federal budget, which we understand must happen. Now, the federal government can do things that Vermont can't. They can, for example, raise income taxes on the wealthiest Vermonters who got a huge tax cut when George Bush became president. President Obama wants to return those cuts so that the wealthy pay their fair share. Raise taxes on the wealthiest Americans. We can't do that in Vermont. We need to compete with other states. We already have a high marginal rate at the top. The federal government can and must. So instead of simply devastating programs for the most vulnerable, let's find the balance between hundreds of millions of dollars of federal help and reductions that would be lower than when the federal help started to flow to help us work our way out of this extraordinary recession. So prudence, good judgment is called for. The continuing resolution is neither of the two.
Don't you have confidence, though, that the Democrats control the Senate, this Democratic president, that these cuts will not become a reality?
Well, you know, I think that's the question, really, Kristen, is how do we get out of this mess? It appears that, and I'll have more information when I come back from Washington this weekend, but it appears that this Tea Party Congress is bent upon undermining low-income people, undermining the economic recovery to make a political point for their base. And the question is, how do you deal with that? Even if you have a Democratic Senate and a Democratic president, at some point you have to pass a budget. And we're asking them to be flexible and to rethink their priorities.
Do you have suggestions as to where they could cut as opposed to these areas you mentioned?
Yeah, I mean, you know, let's be honest about this. America has, proportionate to every other developed country, we spend more on bombs and bombers than we do on hungry children. And I think that's an area where the federal government could make some reductions. You know, the Cold War is over. The war on terrorism requires a different kind of military, as we all know, and I think there's fat in the military budget.
F-35 engine, for example?
Well, you know, the list goes on, but the fact of the matter is that we have a military-industrial complex in this country that means that we run huge deficits and that we ask the poorest of the poor to suffer. And I just think our priorities are misguided.
What about the Deficit Commission's recommendations, changes to Medicare, changes to Social Security, maybe raising the retirement age? Would you support some of those other changes to entitlement programs that are also part of the escalating deficit?
You know, I think as we go forward as a country, and, you know, I'm not running for Congress. I don't want to serve in Congress. So we'll let them wind through those questions. I'm focusing on how we keep Vermont sustainable, growing jobs and balancing our budget. All I can say is it's clear that things have to change in Washington. I'm not arguing with that. All I'm saying is that to go from a government that bailed all of the states out and made the judgment that if they didn't, they bailed out big banks too, let's not forget that. You know, they bailed out banks that had, frankly, fleeced Main Street for extraordinary profits on Wall Street. They helped to bail out the states, and to go from a policy that thoughtfully attempts to jumpstart jobs, and I think we've had some success there. We're seeing some green shoots, to suddenly a policy where you not only reduce spending, but you go below the levels pre-recession. I just don't think that makes any sense. It is a chaotic way to govern, and it will have devastating effects for Vermonters.
You have the option to raise the top marginal rate in Vermont to offset some of the human services cuts here, but you don't want to do. But you'd like Congress to do that in Washington. Could you resolve those things?
Sure. You know, Vermont is not an island. We all know that people will pay a certain amount of taxes on a state level, and when those taxes are disproportionate compared to neighboring states, they migrate. The income tax is particularly portable. We all know that we have a very progressive income tax in Vermont, and I'm proud of that. I helped write the tax code that keeps it progressive. The wealthiest should pay the most. But when you get up around 9%, frankly, you start to lose more than you gain. So the federal government should be raising taxes on the wealthiest Americans who are paying the lowest taxes at any time in American history. The state of Vermont does not have the flexibility to do that because we all know that New Hampshire's to our east and Florida's not far away, and frankly my job is to take the 435 high income taxpayers in Vermont and grow that base, grow our customer base so that we have more revenue.
But isn't that kind of a mixed message you're sending those Vermonters who you say you want to protect, but you're saying I'm not going to raise the taxes here, but I'm telling the federal government it's okay if you do it across the board?
Well, it's not a mixed message. It's simple math. If we raise income taxes so that we're not competitive with neighboring states, we will lose income taxpayers in Vermont. If the federal government does it, there is nowhere to go. and they should pay higher taxes. So it's really a simple business calculation. My job as governor is to ensure that we get as much as we can from the income tax, which we are right now, and ensure that we not only keep our income taxpayers in Vermont, but we grow our customer base so that we have more revenue, not less.
But Governor, I think there's some confusion here between the marginal rates and the actual rate that the wealthy in the state pay. Because if you look at the effective rates, the wealthy pay 5.4%, those who make more than $500,000 to $1 million a year. And that's absolutely comparable with all of our neighbors. It's actually less in some cases.
Well,
So I don't understand how you can make this argument, particularly when there's $190 million worth of savings potentially. The wealthy is 5% because of the tax breaks that have been pushed forward.
all I can tell you is that, I don't know where you get your numbers, but I can tell you that Vermont's marginal income tax rates are high at the top, and they should be. They're high compared to our neighboring states, and they should be. We don't have the capacity to raise them higher.
The
And-
Blue Ribbon Tax Commission came up with those rates. I'm not making that up.
Well, you know, all I can tell you is there's very few high income taxpayers in Vermont. I don't buy the argument that people are paying 5%. I happen to have been one of those taxpayers, and I can tell you, I don't know how they pay 5%.
The 435 Vermonters refers to an income above what?
It's about 373,000.
I think the difference here is that we're talking about the difference between adjusted gross income and taxable income.
I understand
So
that.
people can
All I'm
find
telling you is that,
deductions,
listen,
right?
New Hampshire has a rate of 0. Florida has a rate of 0. That's who we compete with. I can take you to any county in Vermont and introduce you to Vermonters who are no longer Vermonters. And we need to find the balance between how we keep them here and how we pay our bills. And anyone that tells me that we are not close to the precipice in terms of what we can ask Vermonters to pay in income taxes, I just think isn't really looking at the facts. I can introduce you to many of my neighbors who no longer are Vermont residents. There is a point where we lose more than we gain, and I think we're there. If anyone wants to refute it, come down and tell me why I got so many people in my county who either moved to New Hampshire or live in Florida 6 months in a day, they claim.
Are you worried that you're sounding like your predecessor?
Listen, I've sounded like this on this issue for as long as I've been in public service. You know, my predecessor was right about some things.